Hey everybody, welcome to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. We got another great show for you tonight. Before we get started, tune in and let me know where you're chiming in from in the world. So just say hello, hit me a like button or a thumbs up or a heart. Let me know that that you're here and tell me where you're tuning in from. Tonight's topic, we're going to be doing a crash course on one of my favorites, and that's vitamin B5. So crash course on vitamin B5. Now, one of its nicknames that you'll see with vitamin B5, let me make that a little bit more legible, or another way to put it is Pantothenate. Sometimes you'll see it written as pantothenic acid, and sometimes you'll see it written as Pantothine. So PANT starts it all three off, but these are kind of three of the major forms that you're going to see in a number of different supplements or on the back of food labeling packages. Sometimes you'll see pantothenate in shampoos or hair care products or skincare products, but that's what this is. So B5, pantothenate, pantothenic acid, or Pantothine. Sometimes you'll see, and this is technically not true, you'll see it written as CoA, like if you're studying biochemistry, med students, or those of you taking biology or biochemistry should know that vitamin B5 is not CoA, but it's a precursor to CoA. So everywhere you see that term CoA, which stands for coenzyme A, understand that you can't produce this substance without vitamin B5, and it's very, very crucial, very, very essential role that it plays in normal human metabolism. So why is this so important? Well, let's talk a little bit about some of its functions. So if we kind of want to dive into why vitamin B5 is so important, it's really one of my favorite because it's one of the most overlooked of all the vitamins. A lot of doctors, because B5 is found in so many foods, because it's so diverse in so many foods, a lot of doctors just completely dismiss the element that vitamin B5 might even be deficient. So it's often under kind of appreciated, if you will. But in my experience, it's a very, very common deficiency, much more common than the textbooks we'll talk about. And so let's talk about some of its functions. So number one, vitamin B5 is important in the production of antibodies. So if you've ever had an antibody test, especially those of you might have had antibody tests done for food allergies. So antibodies are things like IgG, IgA, IgM, IgE. So your traditional antibodies, these four. So generally when doctors are measuring immune responses, a lot of times they're going to measure your antibody responses. And you need vitamin B5 enabled to be able to form antibodies or produce antibodies. And that's not the only function. Vitamin B5 is necessary to make cholesterol. Now, a lot of you are saying, well, I better not take it because my doctor told me my cholesterol is high and too much cholesterol is a bad thing. Remember how critical cholesterol is. If you haven't heard me talk in depth about cholesterol, you should go back and review my crash course on cholesterol. But cholesterol is super important because it helps us make CoQ10, helps us make vitamin D. Cholesterol helps us make, guys, testosterone. Ladies, helps you make estrogen and progesterone. So cholesterol is very, very important. B5 is cholesterol is oftentimes referred to as the mother hormone, right? And so without vitamin B5, you don't get a mother hormone. So think of vitamin B5 as the father to the mother hormone, and know that it's very, very important for that particular function. Now, additionally, this is another kind of caveat near and dear to my heart, is that vitamin B5 is necessary to form cortisol. Now, why is that so important? Cortisol is your body's fire truck, right? It's your body's way of fighting inflammation. So it's kind of your internal fire truck, so to speak. So anytime you have inflammation, your body should respond by producing more cortisol to, control that inflammation so that it doesn't completely overtake your life. So chronic inflammation, for example, chronic inflammation out of control can lead to a lot of different types of health issues, including heart disease, Alzheimer's, diabetes, dementia. It can cause chronic pain, muscle pain, joint pain, arthritis. So remember, we don't want chronic inflammation. We want our body's natural ability to control that inflammation to be intact. And that's one of the most important functions, in my opinion, of vitamin B5. Now, another function that we've talked about with B vitamins in the past, and I've done a number of B vitamin crash courses with you, but you need vitamin B5 to get energy from carbs, fat, and protein. It's part of how we break these things down. And without the vitamin B5, that CoA, which is what B vitamin helps to produce, CoA is kind of a rate limiting step or rate limiting substrate for you to be able to convert carbs, fats, and proteins into energy, or what the body uses as energy, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So you've got to have vitamin B5 to drive energetics, to drive the energy production from the food that you eat. So if you're finding yourself chronically tired or chronically hungry, these might be symptoms that your B5 is not, up to par or up to speed. Now, a couple of other functions of vitamin B5 are in additional hormone and neurotransmitters. So acetylcholine, this is one that's extremely important. Acetylcholine is one of the main neurotransmitters or neurochemicals. So think of this as a brain chemical, but it's not just the brain, it's the central nervous system, but also the peripheral nervous system, but it's a brain and nervous system chemical that allows your nerve cells to communicate. So it allows for talking between your nerves, right? Without that, you're kind of out of business, right? If you don't have adequate acetylcholine. Now, for those of you who ever do working out or weightlifting, for those of you who've ever had fatigue, and I'm not talking about muscle soreness here, because some people will work out too much and their muscles will get overly tired and overly sore, and they'll need time to recover. But what happens for some people is this right here, is they get neurologically tired. So it's not like a physical fatigue where you don't generate adequate energy to be able to work out, but it's a neurological fatigue. And so your nerves don't communicate to your muscles as well. And that can be one type of athletic fatigue. So if you're trying to compete and you're finding that you can't do what you used to, it's not because you're not strong, it's because you don't feel like you've got the coordination to your muscles, or you don't feel like your nerves and your muscles are firing together. You might have yourself an acetylcholine production problem. And again, you got to have vitamin B5 to form that acetylcholine. Now, you also need vitamin B5 to form another neurochemical. This one's very important, and that's epinephrine. Now, it's important to understand that epinephrine, also in some circles known as adrenaline, most of you probably heard of adrenaline before. You need adrenaline or epinephrine in order to produce noradrenaline. You also need it in order to produce dopamine. So think of how this pathway works is first you produce epinephrine, and then several stages of biochemistry later, we're actually producing dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that helps us maintain our neural communication with our muscles to keep us balanced and to keep us toned. In essence, think about it like this. I'll give you an example, a disease example. Parkinson's disease is a disease where the part of the brain that produces a lot of our dopamine is damaged. And so what happens is we get a kind of a shuffling gait, and people get tremors, right? So again, you need vitamin B5 to regulate epinephrine to norepinephrine to dopamine production. And if you don't have adequate quantities of it, you can run into neurological troubles in that way as well. So these are some of your main functions of vitamin B5. Again, antibody production can lead to immunosuppression. And I said earlier, if you've ever had one of those food allergy tests where doctors were measuring antibodies, most of the doctors will do this test. They'll measure IgG, which I don't agree with, but for food allergy testing. But this is what a lot of you bring to me when you come and see me, is you bring me an IgG test for food allergies, and it's not all that accurate. And one of the reasons why I never like to see just an antibody test for any of these things is because sometimes what happens is your overall antibody levels that you're producing are low. And so if you're relying on an antibody style of test to determine whether you're allergic to something or sensitive to something, you might get a false negative on that test result. And what I find, at least in study after study and person after person that comes to see me, is a lot of times we have this B5 deficiency. And so that B5 deficiency creates a problem when you're trying to measure antibodies, because B5 deficiency can cause your antibody levels to be low. And so again, you might not find something that you're allergic to because your overall measurement is inaccurate because of a deficiency. So I always find that testing for this is very, very important if you're trying to really, truly assess the overall function of somebody's immune system and their capacity to react or not react to a food or a chemical substance in the environment. And then again, so antibodies, cholesterol, cortisol, carbs, fat, protein, energy production, acetylcholine, which is your main brain communication neurotransmitter, and then epinephrine, dopamine, and actually epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. So again, those are your predominant functions of vitamin B5. Now, next, let's talk, let me make some room on the board here, or we'll just draw it over here. Let's talk about symptoms of vitamin B5 deficiency. Now, one of the symptoms is a physical symptom, not on the list here, and that's premature graying of the hair. So if you 20 years old and your hair is turning gray, this can be, and there are other things certainly that can cause gray hair, but I want to be clear that premature graying of the hair is a hallmark kind of classic symptom of severe vitamin B5 deficiency. And its nickname, actually, if we go back to, what do we call vitamin B5? We said pantothenate, pantothenic acid, pantethine, but its nickname originally, it was as when this vitamin was originally discovered, it was discovered by the famed biochemist Roger Williams, who called it the let's use a different marker here, I'm running out of juice, the anti-graying factor. Okay, it was also called the anti-stress factor. And so what this scientist discovered is, and the studies were done in mice originally, so what was discovered is that when mice were deprived of this substance, of this B5 substance, then their brown coats would turn gray, and if you reintroduced B5 back into their diet, then their brown or their gray coats would turn back brown. So that's why it was originally kind of classed out as the anti-graying factor, the anti-stress factors. Also anti-stress factor because remember, part of what we need to produce cortisol is vitamin B5, and cortisol is one of our anti-stress hormones. And so this goes back to why it's also called the anti-stress factor. We actually know that, I mean, the studies in animals are very, very clear on this, that if you give animals extra vitamin B5, what happens is their ability to produce cortisol actually increases. So think of this in terms of humans. Now, I know you can't just directly extrapolate mice studies or animal studies to humans, but a number of doctors like myself, including myself, have seen this play out time and time again, where people are under extreme chronic inflammatory stress. And one of the scenarios here is when they've been on long-term steroids. So those of you who've had long-term steroid use, a lot of times, depending on your dose and depending on how much, but when you're on long-term steroids, one of the side effects of that is it will reduce your body's natural ability to produce your own cortisol. Because remember what those long-term steroids are. They're corticosteroids. We're not talking about long-term steroids like testosterone. We're talking about long-term steroids like corticosteroids. And over time, they actually can shrink your own adrenal glands or atrophy your own adrenal glands, leaving you with less of an ability to produce your own cortisol. And so think of who's on a long-term steroid. Commonly what I've seen, people with asthma inhalers, people with chronic pain and chronic inflammation, intermittent steroids, people with traumatic injuries or traumas where you've had steroid injections or things of that nature multiple times to get the injury under control. So these are some of your main reasons, but also a lot of you that might suffer with skin inflammation like psoriasis or skin inflammation, eczema, one of those that usually have a cause. Now, trauma, not so much, helps you fight off inflammation in a natural way. So it's important. Going off topic here, I was talking about the anti-stress factor, but this is one of the reasons why, is that you need vitamin B5 to make your own cortisol. But if you're taking external versions of corticosteroids over time, you reduce your body's capacity to produce its own cortisol. And I have seen cases, a number of cases, where people were in this scenario, and higher doses of vitamin B5 were extremely helpful at helping them dig themselves out of that hole where their adrenal glands were in a fatigued mode. And I know a lot of mainstream medicine, mainstream medical docs will say there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue unless you have not Graves' disease, but Addison's disease, which is a form of autoimmune adrenal gland fatigue. But unless you have Addison's, there's no such thing as adrenal fatigue. When again, a number of us in the functional realm who see people on a regular basis see adrenal fatigue quite commonly. And one of the ways that you can ask your doctor to measure your cortisol output. So this is just kind of a side note here. You can test what's called and I would recommend, it's a simple test. It's a 4-point cortisol. So they measure your cortisol output at different times of the day, typically morning, noon, afternoon, and nighttime. That's why it's called a 4-point cortisol. You should also have your ACTH measured if you haven't already. Ask your doctor, get with your doc and talk to them about measuring ACTH. ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. It's the hormone from your brain that tells your adrenal glands to produce cortisol. So you can have a malfunction here, but you can also have an inability to produce adequate quantities of cortisol because you don't have the base ingredients that goes into producing cortisol. And one of those base ingredients, very importantly, again, is vitamin B5. So in trying to help you make sense of some of this. So going back to the symptoms. So after talking about all that, right, symptoms, we said premature gray hair, but one of the other symptoms is the inability to cope with stress. And so if you're not coping with stress very well, if you found that at one point in your life you could really handle a lot more stress than what you're capable of handling today, that might be a sign that your vitamin B5 levels aren't adequate. So inability to cope with stress, and again, this is one of the reasons why. Anti-stress hormone, the anti-stress factor, you need B5 to produce cortisol. Cortisol is your fire truck. So we go every day with inflammation. Everybody in the world has a level of inflammation in their body at any given moment in time. So it's not inflammation that's evil. It's the inability to regulate how aggressive that inflammation sets in and how it goes away. And vitamin B5 production of cortisol is one of those mechanisms, and that's why this symptom can manifest. Now, additionally, we might see somebody, and I know this is kind of a generic symptom because a lot of people struggle with fatigue, and there are thousands of different causes for fatigue, but fatigue is definitely a symptom of vitamin B5 deficiency, lack of focus. So lack of, think of it as lack of brain focus. Some people call that fog, right? Or brain fog itself can be a symptom of vitamin B5 deficiency. Now, one of the hallmark classic symptoms, and I talked a little bit about this in the crash course on nutrients and neuropathy, is burning foot neuropathy. And this is where the feet burn. It's called a burning neuropathy, but it's very, very common and classic to see vitamin B5 deficiency create this type of problem. Now, I do want to back up on this premature gray hair for just a minute. I know many of you may be looking at, okay, my hair turned gray early, and so now you're going to go rifle down, bottle after bottle of vitamin B5. Here's what we know. I just want to be clear. We can see premature graying of the hair, but taking more B5, there's no clinical research that shows that. Now, here's what I have seen in my own experience with people coming to see me, is if their hair is turning gray prematurely or it's accelerated graying, B5 doesn't necessarily reverse the graying that's already occurred, but it does stop the aggressive graying in many cases. So I want to be clear that, if you've got gray hair and you think you're going to go buy a bottle of vitamin B5 and reverse your gray hair and have a normal, whatever your color of hair is back, it's probably not going to happen. I just don't want to give any of you a false perception or misconception that taking B5 is somehow going to reverse the gray hair that you already have. Not something I've seen, although I've seen it slow it down in people who are starting to turn gray if we put them on vitamin B5, especially when they're deficient. We see that process really, really slow down and basically start to regulate out again. So these are your classic kind of symptoms of vitamin B5 deficiency: premature gray hair, inability to cope with stress. These are probably two of the kind of big ones. And then fatigue is a little bit more generic. Brain fog is a little bit more generic because there's a lot of different causes for these. And then the classic here, the burning foot neuropathy. If you've got that, there's a very, very strong possibility that you have a vitamin B5 deficiency. Now, as I said earlier, a lot of people don't believe in vitamin B5 deficiency. A lot of our healthcare providers and community don't believe in vitamin B5 deficiency. And I think one of the reasons why they don't believe in it is because, not that it doesn't exist, but no one tests for it. If you never test for it, you don't really see it. So you can say that it doesn't exist. I test for it in everybody who walks through the door, and I see it as a very, very common scenario, especially in people who have chronic inflammatory problems and they're under tremendous stress from the illness and from the medications that they're on. It's a tremendous amount of stress. And so we know that these are the symptoms of vitamin B5 deficiency, but what are the causes of vitamin B5 deficiency? And one of the biggest ones is chronic severe stress. And chronic severe stress comes in many different flavors. One flavor is having a chronic inflammatory illness where you've been to multiple specialists after multiple specialists, you're not better, the medicines aren't working, and the disease itself stresses you out, but then the inability to figure out why you have the disease stresses you out even further. So it's like compounding stress. And then everybody around you telling you shouldn't be sick, if that fits you, then that's chronic severe stress, right? And what this can do is it can deplete your vitamin B5. Now, just like chronic severe stress can do it, so too can chronic severe inflammation. As we talked about a minute ago, inflammation will burn through your B5 and over time will make it more and more scarce. So we get severe stress, we get severe inflammation. A couple of other things that we know can create or tend to lead toward lower levels of vitamin B5 is just generalized malnutrition. So, we might see somebody who's like an anorexic, somebody who's not eating adequate food overall, because where we see frank and overt vitamin B5 deficiency are in the severely malnourished. And so most of that doesn't include people in industrialized countries, especially like the US or the UK. You don't see severe malnourishment unless somebody's self-inducing, they're just not eating. So malnutrition can be a cause. And so if your history is one of anorexia, then you might be a candidate for looking at this a little bit more closely. And then the other one, we mentioned chronic inflammation, but specifically gluten. Gluten exposure for many people causes GI tract damage, which leads to chronic inflammation, but something even more important, it leads to chronic malabsorption, maldigestion and malabsorption. So diseases that inflame the GI tract that can cause malabsorption and maldigestion, things like predominantly celiac disease, which is an inflammatory small intestinal disorder caused by gluten sensitivity. This is a big one, but other things can cause damage to the gut and the stomach. I mean, there are a number of different medications that we know can damage the GI tract lining. For example, if you're taking an angiotensin receptor blocker type of blood pressure medication, those can actually mimic the damage that gluten causes. So those can cause severe malabsorption syndromes in people that lead to things like vitamin B5 deficiency. So again, if you've ever been put on a blood pressure lowering medication that's an ARB, an angiotensin receptor blocker, that would be something to consider. Other drugs that can damage the GI tract, we know that steroids, interestingly enough, long-term steroids, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, so NSAIDs, let's just put it over here. So meds, if we're talking about meds, NSAIDs stands for non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, but also steroids can do this. So, and then ARBs, angiotensin receptor blockers, I'll just abbreviate that as ARB. Okay, these are just different kinds of medications that, again, can set the stage for damage in the GI tract that might cause malabsorption or poor digestion. Additionally, those of you who might have had a surgery, like a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, something along the lines of gastric surgery where you're bypassing part of the stomach acid production, because one of the things that we need to absorb vitamin B5 is we need adequate stomach acid to do that. So there's There's also the component of blocking stomach acid. So that would be another thing you might want to consider on this list of things that might be contributing to a vitamin B5 deficiency. But again, these first two are really, for most people that come in to see me, these are two big ones. And then gluten is very, very common. Gluten sensitivity is much more common than people give it credit for. The most celiac associations and research facilities around the world will say that celiac disease affects 1 in 133 people. However, my experience is that gluten sensitivity is a much more pervasive problem. Not everybody, so you got to remember that not everybody with gluten sensitivity develops celiac disease. There's a whole set of diseases that are linked to gluten exposure that have nothing to do with celiac disease. So if you don't have celiac disease, it doesn't mean that you're not gluten sensitive. In essence, everyone with gluten sensitivity doesn't develop celiac disease. Everybody with celiac disease is gluten sensitive, but not everybody with gluten sensitivity develops celiac disease. Sometimes they develop other problems. So you have to keep that in mind. These are really, really big ones. And again, chronic meds, if you're on chronic meds, there's always a potential risk for the development of drug-induced nutritional deficiencies, which is a topic near and dear to my heart. I've lectured worldwide on that topic for a number of years. So again, these are your major causes of vitamin B5 deficiency. Next, let's talk about where you can find B5 in the diet. So where do we get vitamin B5 in the diet? So let's break down the word here. Panto, if we really look at the root, this is a Greek word, pantos. Pantos means everywhere. So B5 is virtually, it's in all foods. It's why it's called Pantothenate, because it's found in everywhere. It's found in pretty much most foods that you would consider eating. But if we're really talking about bang for buck, so like high quantities of B5 in certain foods, probably the best source of B5 outside of supplementation, we're talking specifically food, is liver, particularly beef liver, very, very high concentrations of vitamin B5. So that's a good source. Other sources of B5 include pretty much all other meats. So if you eat any meats, vegetables, fruits, nuts, they're all going to have B5, but particularly higher scores of B5. Mushroom is an example of a food that has high levels of B5. Let's just write these down for you. Mushroom, so liver, mushroom's a good source. Is again, all meats are really good sources of vitamin B5 as a total, all vegetables. And then particularly those of you, probably a lot of you listening, are on a keto diet. So let's just throw avocado on that list. Avocado, most of you probably eating quite a bit of that. It's a really good source of vitamin B5 in the diet. So these are some, again, high quality sources of vitamin B5 that you can get. So again, most people don't just develop B5 overnight. It's usually a long, slow process of consistent chronic inflammation coupled with a lot of these other things that we've been talking about, right? That over time just continues to deplete the levels of B5 to the point where now your body is struggling biochemically to produce what it needs to help you function and maintain your capacity to cope with life and things in general. Now, I wanted to touch on another topic before we take questions, because there's a lot of hype around the treatment of different types of conditions using high dose vitamin B5, and one of them is acne. So if we're talking about acne, there have been some really good research studies on chronic acne and vitamin B5. And some of these studies were double-blind, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials, which is kind of in medicine is considered the gold standard of research. So some studies are showing that high levels of vitamin B5 can actually improve acne quite prolifically. Like we can take somebody with severe inflammatory acne on high doses of vitamin B5 and see that the skin starts to clear. Now, you've got to get upwards of 5, 10, even as much as 20 grams of vitamin B5 to achieve some of those doses. The good news is that there's really no known toxic level of vitamin B5. I mean, you can, if you get up higher than 20 grams a day, you're probably shoving down a pretty hefty amount of B5 bottles per week. So you probably I mean, it's probably just not a good idea in general to think of doing that. But there's no, I mean, aside of a little gastric nausea that's been reported, there are really no known great toxicity effects. It's really quite safe in terms of is it dangerous to take it in higher doses over some time? Look, anything can be toxic at high enough levels, but there's no severe toxicity data that's been reported on vitamin B5, even at very, very high levels. Something else that that you'll see people doing with vitamin B5 is rheumatoid arthritis. So if you suffer with rheumatoid RA, there have been some really good research studies that show that people with RA, which is a chronic inflammatory autoimmune disease, do really, really well and have a reduction in pain and morning stiffness when they're taking higher doses of vitamin B5. And if you think about it, that goes back to what we've been talking about with this cortisol connection, right? How does your body basically protect you from excessive inflammation? It does so with cortisol, your body's natural fire truck. So B5, taking this in conjunction with rheumatological disease, you know, the potential for it to improve your body's ability to make its own cortisol and fight your own inflammation and pain, you know, very, very, you know, research is backing that up. So again, RA and B5 is one of those connections. And then there's another one, which I don't recommend doing unless you have something called hyperlipoproteinemia or familial hyperlipoproteinemia, is people that have what they think is elevated cholesterol. And again, if you don't know what that means, go back and watch my crash course on cholesterol. I don't have time to get into all the ins and outs of cholesterol tonight, but some people are using this form right here. So this form, Pantothene, has the ability to lower cholesterol. So some people think their doctors are telling them your cholesterol is too high. And so then this is one of the natural options that they're diving into to use to help reduce, you know, their cholesterol, you know, with a natural substance. And it works. It can lower cholesterol. It can lower triglycerides. There's research that backs this up. So yes, it can. Although remember, what is and what is not high cholesterol is the thing I want you to go learn about, because, you know, some doctors will tell you that if your cholesterol is above 200, that it's too high. I think that's preposterous and ridiculous. But again, go watch my video on cholesterol if you want to learn more about that. So I'm going to dive into some of the questions and get your questions answered. So if you got questions, make sure you start pumping them into the feed now, and we'll do our best to get as many answered as we can. So let's see here. If your kidneys are weaker, Renee wants to know, if your kidneys are weaker, what is the best way to get these? So your kidneys being weak or strong really doesn't have a whole lot to do with your ability to take vitamin B5. I mean, the best way to get vitamin B5 at higher doses, aside from the foods I listed earlier, is supplementation. And so kind of generally a supplementation protocol, depending on, you know, again, if you're going to do something like a high dose vitamin B5 regimen, I always encourage you to work with a good, well-trained doc in nutrition, somebody who's been trained in nutrition and knows what the heck they're doing. But kind of a lot of doctors will start out between 250 milligrams and 500 milligrams of pantothenic acid a day. That's not the 20 up to 20 grams of pantothenate that I was talking about here with the acne research and literature that's been being done. But this is just more for generalized nutritional support. So 250 to 500 milligrams, depending on the person. And then if the deficiency is severe enough, I've seen, you know, where people respond really, really well to, you know, to much more than that. You know, 2,000 milligrams is kind of really good and effective strategy that I've seen work really, really well with a lot of people who come to see me. But again, if you're gonna get upwards of that 500 milligrams multiple times a day, my advice would be working with somebody who can help you understand how to do it right. And it is not that it's super rocket science, but you don't want to take so much. There's some other factors involved with taking too much vitamin B5, and one of those factors, which we didn't mention yet, so I'll go ahead and mention it, is that vitamin B5 and biotin, we believe, are absorbed by the same type of mechanism inside the small intestine. And so if you're taking too much vitamin B5, like high doses for really long periods of time, one of the potentials is that you might cause a vitamin B9 deficiency, or not B9, but B, well, depends on which literature you read. It's biotin. Biotin is oftentimes referred to as vitamin B7. It's sometimes referred to as vitamin B8. But it's possible you induce a biotin deficiency when you're taking too much pantothenate, and vice versa. It's possible you induce a pantothenate deficiency if you're taking too much biotin, because of they going through on the same receptor site, so, or on the same mechanism of action of absorption in the intestine. So you want to be careful about just mega dosing everything just for the sake of mega dosing. Let's see here. RH wants to know how to get intracellular testing. Yeah, that is the best way. If you're talking about how do we test for B5 deficiency, intracellular testing is ask your doctor for what's called lymphocyte proliferation. It's a type of testing methodology that helps to understand what your nutritional status is. So lymphocyte is a type of white blood cell, and proliferation is a methodology that allows you to measure the growth rate of those white blood cells based on the quantity of nutritional storage inside those cells. And so it gives you an accurate indicator of whether or not you're deficient in that nutrient. And because a lymphocyte has a 6-month lifespan, instead of like a urine test or a blood test, it only gives you an indicator of yesterday's diet, which when you're testing for nutrient deficiencies, understand that testing yesterday's diet is a bad idea, because you may have eaten plenty of vitamin B5 yesterday, and you may have fasted yesterday. And it just depends on what you ate and what you did, and that test that you do, the standard tests are just going to show a direct reflection of your recent diet. We want something that gives you a long-term average. That 6-month average is more accurate. 6-month assessment. So it tells you kind of over time what your B5 levels have looked like and whether or not you're getting adequate quantities, enough to make your cells have the capacity to replicate and function. So very, very important that the right methodology is used if you're trying to really assess whether or not you have a deficiency. Okay, let's see here. Oh, yeah. So when you're taking, that's something else. Juan's wanting to know about seizure medications, anticholinergics, and vitamin B5. Yeah, so certain seizure medications, if you're on certain anti-dementia medications, if you're on tetracycline, which is a type of antibiotic, these things can all compete and interfere with each other. So it's important if you're on certain medications, if you're thinking about using vitamin B5, that you get with your doctor so that you know what you're doing, you don't create a problem. Oh, I love that. Somebody says, thanks for the meatball soup recipe. It was delicious. You're welcome. Hey, those of you who don't know, we put out about 8 recipes a month, and the way you can get access to those is either one, subscribing to me right here, or number 2, go over to glutenfreesociety.org, which is what I encourage you to do. It's our newsletter. It's the world's #1 gluten-free newsletter, with a couple 100,000 people subscribing to that newsletter. So it's one of the largest communities in the world that conglomerate together to discuss, how to go gluten-free in the proper way. Come visit us and come be a part of that community, especially if you're trying to figure all this out. Let's see here. Are parasites a huge contributor? Dwayne wants to know, are parasites a huge contributor to people being anemic, being that they attach themselves in our gut, throat, and etc.? They can be. I mean, parasites in the United States, I know a lot of people will say parasites. I've seen a lot of doctors say parasite. Everybody has them. I haven't seen that to be the truth. I haven't seen that to be the case. And you have to be real careful about demonizing all parasites, because some parasites aren't really parasites. They're actually symbiotic microorganisms that live with us and actually do good things for us. So you kind of have to be careful about what you actually are calling a parasite. But yes, parasites can contribute to anemia, and they can contribute to a lot of people's anemia. But I would say, to what degree or how great, I don't think anybody really truly knows. So Mark wants to know, what can be used in a natural form to lower cholesterol? Mark, go watch my video, my crash course on cholesterol. I don't know if we can publish that link here in the feed for you or not, but you got to start from the premise of understanding what high cholesterol actually is, because many people try to lower their cholesterol and do so to their own detriment. And I don't want you to do something in that regard, or I don't want to lend you down the wrong road. So Vincent wants to know more info about acne. Yeah, we can do a whole show on acne. I'll do that. I'll do that, Vincent. Thanks for the tip. Can amoeba from India and companion bacteria eat up the B5? It's kind of a weird question, Rosie, not because it's weird, but amoeba is can be a type of parasite. So in that regard, yeah, I mean, parasites growing in your intestine can cause vitamin and mineral deficiency. There's no doubt about that. Specifically, what kind of anemia? But then the other one is bacteria eat up the B5. Generally speaking, depends on what kind of bacteria too. If you've got bacterial infection, it's causing long-term chronic inflammation, and so you're taking a steroid and antibiotics and things of that nature repetitively over time, then yeah, you're going to churn through some B5. But you have to remember too that your good bacteria, we didn't talk about this, but one of the places you can get B5 aside from food is your gut. Your gut produces bacteria, and not produces bacteria, but your gut bacteria produce vitamin B5. So healthy flora, can synthesize some of the B5 for our needs. Now, the science isn't real clear on this. In other words, scientists don't yet agree, and researchers don't yet agree on exactly what quantity is that. 30% of your daily need, 40% of your daily need. The numbers aren't up and out yet, but we do know that gut flora can produce vitamin B5, and so that's something to think about when you're thinking about taking an antibiotic. It's something to think about when you have an infection, etc. Is it possible that intolerance to heat besides burning feet may be due to vitamin B5 deficiency? So intolerance to heat as a general rule of thumb, I haven't seen that be the case. It doesn't mean it's not possible. There are a lot of strange things that happen in different people because of their own uniquenesses, their own unique biochemical differences. But I just personally, Marie, I've never seen that written about in relationship to other research on vitamin B5 deficiency. And I've never seen anybody clinically experience or report that kind of symptom to me as a result of being vitamin B5 deficient. So hopefully that's helpful for you. So intolerance to cold. So we're going both ends of the spectrum. So Vincent wants to know, what about intolerance to cold? Can intolerance to cold be a symptom of vitamin B5 deficiency? Look, intolerance to cold can be a symptom of a lot of different things. I'd say specifically the first thing that should be entertained with intolerance to cold should be all of your B vitamins, not just B5, because your B vitamins, it's not just B5 that helps you to generate energy from carbs, fats, and proteins. It's all the B vitamins, the whole family. So B vitamin deficiencies as a whole, as a family, can lead to that type of problem. So an alternative to beef liver would be chicken liver, Denise, or lamb, or any other animal that you might eat where you could get access to the liver. Okay. Yeah, any form of liver. The question's coming up repetitively over about whether or not liver is something that, aside from beef liver, might be a good source of B5. And yes, liver really from any animal is going to be a good source of B vitamins. Think of it like this. This is kind of a lesson I learned when I was in graduate school. My biochemistry teacher always said, the liver is the giver, meaning the liver stores the nutrients to give to the body in times of need. So that's one of the great things about the liver. A lot of people, give the liver a bad rap because it's the organ of detoxification. And so they think because it detoxifies, it is full of toxins. And that's not really true. The liver is full of nutrients so that it can detoxify. So I'd say liver from any animal would be adequate, provided the animal's health is solid. Okay. Oh, this is a question not really related to B5. Donna wants to know, why do legs cramp at night? Generally, if you've got nighttime leg cramping, look at calcium. Calcium deficiency is oftentimes present when people have nighttime cramps. So it might be just as simple as a few calcium pills to help those go away. But there are certainly other causes of cramps that you should visit your doctor with and see if they can help you to determine that. Burning fingers. So burning fingers, yes, burning neuropathy doesn't have to just be the feet. It's just that's where it tends to show up first. So burning fingers, burning hands can also be a symptom of vitamin B5 deficiency. Let's see. Andrea wants to know how to keep her sodium up. So that's kind of a specific question, Andrea. I'd need a lot more detail to really get that with you. My advice to you, if you're having trouble with low sodium because of your seizure medication, I'd really ask a deeper question. Why are you having seizures? And that goes with any medication. Generally speaking, when you go to the doctor, and again, generally speaking, when you go to the doctor says you have X, Y, or Z disease, gives you a diagnosis, and then makes a recommendation of either some type of medical intervention. Typically, that's a medication. And so I'm not really a fan of that methodology, because if you identify a disease but you don't identify why the disease exists, then the medication doesn't solve your problem. The medication just biochemically alters your symptoms. And so really, when it comes to seizure disorder, I have seen this repetitively, and I would encourage you to investigate this, is gluten. If you've got any form of autoimmune disease and you haven't been tested for gluten sensitivity, you need to ask your doctor to test you. And the key here is not any test. You want genetic testing. And if your doctor won't do it, you can go through Gluten-Free Society. We actually, my foundation has the ability to help people get access to that type of test, because that is a big problem, is a lot of doctors just won't run it. But epilepsy, seizure disorder, highly, highly correlated and linked to gluten, meaning that it can be caused by gluten sensitivity. And so no amount of anti-epileptic seizure medication is going to fix that if you don't change your diet. So that's what I would suggest that you really look into, Andrea. Okay. So you wants to know low cortisol throughout the day and Raynaud's phenomena or Raynaud's syndrome. A functional coach put me on B5. How much and for how long should I take it? Look, that's too deep of a question for me to answer. I mean, remember, this show's not about me giving you medical advice. This show's about me answering, more simple questions. I can't go in and answer individual one-on-one questions. I don't have a history about you. I don't really know much about you other than you've tuned in a number of Monday nights. So really the best way to do that would either be call my office and set up a consultation if you want to kind of do a deep dive, or to get with your regular doc and ask that question. Is B5 essential for cardiovascular health? It depends on who you ask. So again, as I was saying earlier, B5 is being used as Pantothene to lower cholesterol in people with high cholesterol. But again, it depends on what you perceive to be as high or low cholesterol. So is it necessary for heart health? I would argue that it is not, but not so much for this reason, so much as it is for all these other reasons, right? Cholesterol is healthy. We need a healthy level of cholesterol to keep our blood vessels healthy. We need to be able to produce antibodies to protect us from infection. And some kinds of infections can attack the heart, the pericardium of the heart, leading to cardiomyopathies. And so in that regard, it's helpful for heart health. Any inflammation, it's helpful for heart health. Generating energy. Remember, your heart consumes vast quantities of energy because it beats even when you sleep. And so, yes, it's very, very important for heart health. But vitamin B5 deficiency doesn't tend to manifest as heart disease. So hopefully that's helpful in answering your question. All right, David, welcome. Glad to see you here, and welcome from Phoenix, Arizona. So Juan says, my body can't produce creatine, accumulates guanidino acetate. Any tips? You need to get with a functional medicine practitioner and have some deeper levels of testing done. That's a pretty complex biochemical question, Juan. Okay. What about Louise wants to know, what if you already produce too much cortisol to the point of feeling tense and anxious almost constantly? I would say if you're producing too much, you have to ask the question why. Most people don't produce too much cortisol. Well, you can, but most people are being overstimulated. So cortisol is not something that generally your body breaks, and so you're making too much of it. It's usually you're making more cortisol. So cortisol elevates. Cortisol goes up from stimuli. So what are the stimuli that are causing your cortisol to increase? Most people that have elevations in cortisol have elevations in inflammation, and so their body's natural cortisol production is ramping up to try to protect them from themselves, because most inflammation that I see in people is either food-induced or lifestyle induced. So it could be stress, it could be the wrong diet, it could be a lack of sleep, it could be lack of exercise. So there's a whole, battery of things that you have control over, that if you're not controlling adequately, your cortisol levels are going to go up, and somebody might perceive that as hypercortisolemia, which and if they're doing that, then they may use a medical intervention or something else that might not be in your best interest. Linda wants to know, if I take a good quality B complex, would that be enough B5 to overcome some of the problems I've had? Been stressed since a little kid, gray streak at 24, Hashimoto's. Obviously have a bunch of nutrient deficiencies that I'm becoming more aware of. So depends on the B complex, Linda. Again, if we're talking about just kind of, let's just say aggressive doses of B5, aggressive meaning kind of more intense use, right? So not like the United States or the FDA daily recommended dose, but kind of more of an intense use with B5. So we'd look at, 250 to 500 milligrams per day. If you're struggling with a deficiency, this is kind of a starting point to kind of look at. And so in some cases, maybe more, in some cases, maybe less. So it just depends on what your B complex has in it. Okay, let's see here. So Brenda wants to know, I heard calcium also affects hair graying. Is this a component? Not so much. The biggest nutrients that can prematurely cause graying of the hair, vitamin B5 and vitamin B12 are the two I see the most in people, but both of those are pretty common. Wanda wants to know foods that are rich in vitamin B5. I think we covered that. Questions about, Anita wants questions about my thyroid. I have a nodule on the right side. I had a CT scan, 2 ultrasounds, and a biopsy. Doc says there's calcification. And blood flow that shows from the ultrasound biopsy says 50% suspicious. Boy, that's kind of a monster question, Anita. Probably not a good place in this forum because it's just too specific and too in-depth. I would say if you're doubting the advice that your doctor's giving you, you might just consider getting a second opinion. But this is probably not the forum for that second opinion. So whether or not you should remove your thyroid, again, I don't want to lead the scale or tip the scale one direction or another. We just don't know each other well enough. Okay, let's see. Next question here. So Nancy wants to know how many per year that I see people with gluten sensitivity. I probably, in my practice, I see 350, 400 people a year new. But in a year, that doesn't, so that's how many people I see directly. How many people are actually gluten sensitive maybe is a deeper question to ask. And I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question. I've seen scientific estimates anywhere from, 1% to up to 40% of the population. So I think it's a much more prevalent problem, but I also think glyphosate and, Roundup and pesticides and genetic hybridization, and there are a number of other factors, the way people eat, the way they take care of themselves today that tend to lead toward aggressive responses to grains that even above and beyond gluten. For those of you who want to know more about gluten and grain-free diets, you can read No Grain, No Pain. It's my book, my best-selling book. You can pick that up. It's published by Simon & Schuster Touchstone, and you can pick it up in any major bookstore. Chucho says, if you have B12 methylation issue, would that contribute to B5 absorption trouble? No, not necessarily. I mean, indirectly, maybe yes, but not directly. Derek, yes, this is live. If you got a question, chime in. What test do you recommend to check for B5 deficiency? I think I answered that earlier, but I'll repeat. Lymphocyte proliferation is the best way to detect that. Rosemarie, what do you mean AFS? I want to make sure I'm using the right acronym for your question. So you say you have a moderate stage of AFS. So delineate what that means to me. When is a good time to take B5? That's what Soon's question is. Soon, the good time to take B5 is breakfast, lunch, or dinner. There's not like a better time. So it's not like better absorbed at a particular time. It's not like better serving you at taking it at a different time. It's best to take it with food so that the food that you're eating mixes with that supplemental B5, and it causes a stimulation, gastric acid secretion, stimulation of pancreatic enzyme and intestinal enzyme dumping, so you get better absorption from it. So Barb wants to know, is a B150 supplement sufficient? So it depends. If the B150 is referring to 150 milligrams of B5, it might be depending on the individual, but it also might not be depending on the individual. So again, it just depends. Been supplementing methylcobalamin because I understand it's poorly absorbed. Methylcobalamin is actually is absorbed actually quite well. It's one of the better absorbed forms and activated forms of vitamin B12, not necessarily B5. Yeah, B5 has been shown to help with hair thinning as well. There have been some research studies that show that B5 helps to reduce hair thinning, and it helps to slow down hair loss. Lymphocyte proliferation, again, I know not a lot of you keep asking about the test, but lymphocyte proliferation is the name of that test. Let's see here. When would you get raised platelet count? Would food do that? It can, Olympia. I mean, one of the side effects of a person with gluten sensitivity can be elevation in platelet counts. I've seen that happen. I've also seen it be the other direction, where people can have low platelet counts as a result of gluten sensitivity. So B5, though, not so much. B5 doesn't have much to do with platelets, although B5 is important for producing hemoglobin in your red blood cells. So you do need vitamin B5 to make adequate functioning red blood cells. Can B5 help Hashimoto thyroid symptoms? I'm gluten-free for 5 years. B5, again, it's not so much that it helps hypothyroid, it's that it helps your body metabolize carb, fat, and protein into energy better, which is in part dependent on your thyroid hormone production. But so typically B5 is important to generate energy, and that energy generation is important to maintain the health of your thyroid. But you need B5 for the energy, and it's not so much that you develop a low thyroid if you don't have adequate B5. Now, there are nutrients that can cause thyroid deficiency, and so as an example, iodine, probably the most well-studied, iodine deficiency can cause a low thyroid, but so can, vitamin C and vitamin B2 and vitamin B12 and vitamin A and vitamin D. So too can selenium and iron deficiency. So there are a number of nutrients. If you want to learn more about the thyroid and vitamins and minerals, you should watch my crash course on the thyroid and the nutrient functions associated with thyroid function. Rajit wants to know, I have a friend who has lupus. Would B5 help? Possibly, through the same connection here, Rajit. So remember, rheumatoid arthritis, research shows that B5 helps people with rheumatoid arthritis have less pain and inflammation. These diseases, lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, are very, very close. Both of them are autoimmune tissue disorders. And so it's very possible that she might get help. But again, I would say your friend shouldn't be guessing at whether B5 could help or not with something like lupus. Like getting into the care of a qualified functional practitioner would be the best advice I could give there. Let's see, scroll up just a little. So would B5 help with thrombocytopenia? Again, I think I answered that a minute ago. Not so much that I have seen either in my practice or in medical literature. A book I just read, Donna wants to know, a book I just read has a program to reverse Alzheimer's. It sounds very much like functional medicine approach. So it depends. So the question is, can you successfully see somebody with Alzheimer's start to regain cognitive function and reverse cognitive decline? You can, but it depends on what stage they're in. So you have to be real careful, because there's a lot of people out there that promise the world, but they can't, my advice would be, anybody who promises you anything, no doctor, no healthcare practitioner can ever predict the future. None of them should ever be able to guarantee an outcome. Like, that's a very unethical thing to do. They may be able to speculate, they may be able to postulate as to what they think might happen, but they should never be guaranteeing an outcome. And with Alzheimer's, what we see in this functional field, and I know several experts who deal and treat functionally Alzheimer's, is we see early stage. So if we catch it, if they can catch it in an early enough stage, yes, you can see cognitive decline reversing. You can see improvements in mental clarity, brain fog, focus, and memory. But if it's late stage Alzheimer's, not so much. So the key there is if you find your mind is going, get in functionally with somebody as quickly as you possibly can to be able to have a greater level of success. Okay. Thyroid nodules. Jolene wants to know for thyroid. Depending on what's causing them, Jolene, thyroid nodules can be caused by a number of different things. You know, for a lot of people, thyroid nodules are an autoimmune process caused by gluten. It's one of those very common associations. For other people, thyroid nodules can be caused by iodine deficiency, can be caused by selenium deficiency. So again, it just depends on the nodule, depends on the person. Okay. Is it better? I think we're running out of time here. I think we're out of time. I'll answer one more. Is it better to do a B5 only supplement or a high B5 in your B complex pill? It depends. Both. Sometimes both. Sometimes a B complex doesn't have, it has all the other Bs, so you want to use it for the support of the other Bs, but it might not have adequate quantities of B5 per se. So it just depends on the level of intensity that you're trying to get from that supplement. But again, you know, some of your B complexes are going to have 100 milligrams a day. And I just said that 250 to 500 is kind of a starting point for an intense use of vitamin B5. So it depends on the B complex vitamin too. So again, you know, we have a B5 formulation. We have a couple different formulations. If you're looking for a gluten-free supplement that you want to take to play with this a little bit, we have what's called B Complete, which is a complete multivitamin or multi-B vitamin, okay? But then we also have one that is higher dose B5, which is just strictly, it's called Ultra B5. So you can look that up in our online store as well. But either one of those or both of them simultaneously, again, very safe for use even at higher doses. But again, I don't recommend, you know, going it alone if you're going to start shooting, you know, into the gram range of vitamin B5 on a daily basis. Okay. So that's it for tonight, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. Again, if you're new to the show, make sure that you subscribe. You can do that by clicking the bell icon. You can also subscribe to our newsletter if you come visit me at glutenfreesociety.org. You can sign up for the newsletter there. If you do, we'll send you a free starter kit and survival guide on how to go gluten-free and what you might want to consider about grain in your diet. And as always, I'm going to ask you to do me a favor. Our goal here is to save 100 million lives. That's the goal. And that we're doing that through outreach. So the more people we can reach, the more lives we can change. If you find the show valuable, if you find the show and the information helpful, I ask you to do one thing, and that is don't be selfish with it. Don't be stingy. Share it. But type in hashtag save 100 million lives for me. That's how people are finding us, is through that hashtag. So make sure you type that in. And as always, thanks for spending your Monday evening with me. I'll see you next Monday, same time, for another episode of Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain. Hey, don't forget to tune in next week, same time, 6 p.m. Central Standard Time, for another Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain show. Bring all your toughest health questions to me. I look forward to answering them. And before you leave today, make sure you hit subscribe. And once you do, click that bell. That bell is going to allow us to remind you right before we go live. But it's also going to allow us to remind you when we come out with other video content all week long. We've got lots of episodes coming your way all week long, and I don't want you to miss anything. So again, subscribe, hit that bell so that you can get notified when we have that new information put up for you. Thanks so much, and I'm wishing you excellent health. Have a great week. We'll see you next Monday night.